let's get into the big topic of open source, something that we actually say at Red Hat.
This is so
We
awesome.
are an open culture that believes
actually
in
a big
employee
piece
What
of
is that process that a developer, or let's say a
As the
developer,
Kubernetes ecosystem really boomed.
Hello and welcome to this week's Ask an OpenShift Admin Office Hours live stream. I am co-host Andrew Sullivan, joined as always by my other co-host, Mr. Jonny Rickard. How are you today, sir?
I'm good, man. I'm hanging in there.
You, I know you. We were talking beforehand. It seems you've come down with a little something.
I got level 3 man flu, or faux COVID. I'm not really sure which one yet.
Typhoid Johnny.
Yeah. I'm trying to make the most out of a bad situation. Yeah. So.
Yeah, well, we appreciate you joining us here, and if you devolve into coughing fits, we'll only we'll send you a bill, for our time.
Good. Well, hopefully my Wi-Fi freezes right when I'm over.
Yeah. Well, I haven't figured out. I that's not giving me a lot of confidence, right? Because I haven't figured out what's going on with my laptop yet. It's got the same glitchiness when we're in Restream here as I did last week. So I don't know what's going on. I even disabled. Last week I was fiddling around with the little gestures in the new Mac OS, and I even disabled that. And it's still doing it. So I don't know.
Oh dang! Yeah, I heard a little crackle when you first started, but that was it.
Yeah. And, usually I keep up another tab that has various chat and other stuff that we have in it. So that way I can respond to folks. And every time I do something, one of those, it crackles and it jitters for a moment. And I don't know.
Oh, weird.
Computers, who knows how they work, right? It's just, I mean, it's two rocks smashed together with electricity running between them. Yeah.
That's right.
Anyways, so hello everyone. Welcome to this week's live stream. So this is an office hours live stream here on Red Hat live streaming, which means that we are here to answer your questions. Anything and everything that is on your mind about OpenShift, we will do our absolute best to answer those questions. However, if we don't know the answers, which let's be honest happens pretty frequently, we do have a whole bunch of resources that we can reach back to inside of Red Hat, whether it's on the product management side or product security side or engineering side or kind of wherever we happen to be at. So all of that to say, please don't hesitate to ask any questions that you happen to have while we're going through the stream, even though today we do have number 2 in our series of topics around or focused around security within the I'll say the broader OpenShift set of capabilities. So that includes not just OpenShift, but ACM, ACS, right? All of those things working together and in conjunction to bring hopefully some additional or a more secure environment, more secure deployments into your environment. I feel like I used environment too many times there. So with that in mind, welcome back, Chris Porter. How are you today, sir?
Good. Good morning. Sorry that you're not feeling well, Johnny, but Dr. Sullivan will take care of you here.
Yep.
Plenty of advice. And
Johnny, you were in the Navy. You remember the peanut butter shot,
I do. Oh man, I was just telling my son about that the other day.
Yep. Everybody marches with a limp in unison.
That's right.
For a couple of days afterwards. So, Chris, today's topic is configuration management for security. Right. If you don't mind, can you elaborate on what that is a little bit here before we get into the top of mind topics?
Yeah. So, this is the exciting part about security, if anything can be said to be such. Last week we talked a lot about vulnerability management, which is job number 1 for most organizations. It's part of compliance standards, but a lot of times security kind of for containers kind of starts and ends there, and compliance often dictates other types of technical controls. And the security configuration to me is like everything else that your application brings to an OpenShift cluster. So it's part of the cluster's configuration itself. It is part of how you specify your application to run in that deployment. It's the recognition that the security of your application on OpenShift is dependent on more than just the container image contents, right? That if you're just looking at the container image, you're missing out on potential security issues that you could remediate with configuration. And then I think the exciting part of this is that you can leverage configuration of your deployments to get to better security, right? To make the impact of, let's say, a breach occurs, right? Let's say someone manages to compromise one of your applications. makes that environment a lot more hostile for that attacker, right? That attacker has goals, right? We know that they want to do certain things in your environment. Maybe they're looking to find and steal sensitive data. Maybe they just want to run a crypto miner. Maybe they just want to, leave a backdoor in so they can use it for other purposes later on. And the configuration of your containerized applications can help to prevent that, even if a vulnerability is present. And we do that by leveraging the kind of nature of containers, right? The containers are not virtual machines. They don't live interesting lives and do interesting things. They have a single task. A container that's backing a single microservice can be limited in what it can do because it doesn't need to do things like install packages and maintain itself and escalate privileges with different user accounts and access lots of things on the network. So the security configuration is all that stuff that helps us limit that. And unfortunately, in the Kubernetes spec and all the implementations out there, you'll find that many of the defaults around these configurations are set kind of wide open, right?
Yeah.
Now, OpenShift locks these things down quite a bit, but there's still some areas where the stuff is kind of wide open, and that's for productivity, right? You don't want to have to jump through a lot of hoops in order to get your first application up and running on OpenShift, right? It's becomes a real hassle.
Some people already argue that you have to do that with non-root containers. So
That's right.
I-
So
it-
non-root containers is a great example, right? It is a little bit of a hurdle, but it's such a safety mechanism that in OpenShift we've decided that that's going to be default. In many other Kubernetes platforms, it's not the default, and you're basically running all your containers as root. And every time we see an effective container escape attack, it always starts with a process running as root in a container.
Yep. Yeah, it's interesting to me, like, and this whole configuration management thing, I think, plays into that. Of a lot of times, you see, organizations that get compromised, and it's basic configuration stuff. It's super basic things. It's item number 6 on the security checklist things that just nobody ever got around to, or it was a newly implemented server and it hadn't gotten to that point yet. And implementing automation tools, configuration management tools to have that stuff done and know that it's being not just done once but done checked and validated repeatedly, stuff like that. It feels so basic, and yet what's the podcast, gosh, I don't have my podcast app up. Why am I completely Darknet Diaries?
I
listen
thought
to,
that's where you're going, but I wasn't sure.
I listen to Darknet Diaries when I commute to and from the Red Hat Tower here, and it's always great to listen to those. But so many times you listen to not just that one but others, and it's we had a basic root password set or something like that. And
That's right.
anyways,
So automation will save you, right? Our philosophy is that these are best practices that you can read about anywhere, and products like ACS will guide you towards that. I'm talking about configuration like not auto mounting service account tokens, right? Changing the user account that you're using so that you're not using a privileged user. It's basic configurations in Kubernetes that teams need to get used to the idea of doing this. It's part of the software development job, right? And the ASS philosophy is that we're going to guide you towards that, put some guardrails around it to say, look, you have to specify these things. I mean, ultimately, we're teaching people how to build better, more secure applications for Kubernetes. So we're hoping that it's not that big an ask, right? It is a little bit more hassle. It is a little bit more YAML that you have to remember. But by making it automated, or by using features in OpenShift, for example, to template projects with things like CPU and memory restrictions, which can be a security precaution. Things like network policies by default to restrict egress. Some of these things are almost like silver bullets for security. There's 2 configurations in particular I encourage everyone to use wherever humanly possible. One is egress policies on your pods. Your pods probably talk to 1 or 2 other pods, and they probably talk to DNS. Very rarely do they need internet access, right? And for a lot of my customers, of course, you're managing actual internet egress at the perimeter, and that's kind of off topic here, right? That's something you continue to do. But by mitigating it at the pod, so many attacks that involve initial compromise, arbitrary code execution, they follow that up with, let's go download a crypto miner or other software, write that payload to disk, and execute it. And by making egress impossible, you just eliminate that chain. You stop that chain, you break it there. The other one is that payload to disk. Containers have writable file systems. this doesn't really make a whole lot of sense in a container, right? I hope nobody listening to this is using the container's root file system for any kind of storage, because you're going to lose that, right? Container file systems are ephemeral, and everything mounted under, var and Etsy and home is all just temporary, right? It's an illusion.
Empty dir.
So,
And we've talked about that before, of how
right.
that also impacts the underlying hosts in various ways. But
That's right.
Chris, I don't want to interrupt your role, but
Yeah.
before you get too far along, there's a number of top of mind topics that I think are important and relevant to, kind of this overall theme here for October of security and rolling into KubeCon here at the end of the month. So
Yeah.
I don't know if you want to finish that thoughts, and then Jonny and I'll switch over to the top of mind stuff.
Yeah, I'll just say that again, the silver bullets there, read-only file systems, right? And using an empty dir, like you said, it's a simple thing. There's tools out there like Podman Diff to tell you if your app is actually writing anything, is changing anything in the file system, so you can sort that out and figure out what you're doing wrong. But if your Java app is writing a log file to the local file system, you should change that behavior and then make those read only, right? It stymies a lot of these what I call naive attacks, right? They're not very sophisticated, but automated attacks that can be devastating. And it's another good example of how containers are not virtual machines, and in security you have this opportunity to not treat them as virtual machines and adopt new lightweight methods, right, that are effective. So we'll get back to that, and I have plenty more to say, but I'll let you guys talk about these top of mind topics.
Okay. Yeah, I was just I'm editing our little thing over here so that way I can keep track of all the stuff that's going on, because it's a busy month in general and overall, and cold or not there, Jonny. So let's see a couple of things that are going on. So one, from a scheduling perspective, so tomorrow, October 12th at 10 a.m. Eastern here on the live stream. So I think it is on the OpenShift channel and the OpenShift Twitch stream, but not on the Red Hat YouTube channel. If you watch us on that one, will be the OpenShift 4.14 What's New presentation from the product management team. So I want to say that that's 60 or 90 minutes. I don't remember how long it is off the top of my head. It looks like it is 60 minutes. And that is the product management team going through and giving an overview of all of the new things and change things that are happening in 4.14. So of course, Jonny and I, we always go through and we pick out the things that we think are going to be most relevant to our audience, to the administrator audience, and we'll cover those in upcoming streams. Although it looks like that probably won't be until like November, December timeframe, because we've just got a ton of stuff on our schedule coming up. So next week, Wednesday at our regular time is going to be runtime security here as a part of the security or DevSecOps month leading into KubeCon here on the Ask an OpenShift Admin show. The week after that, October 25th, is CI/CD pipeline security. We'll be talking about supply chain and kind of all of that other stuff with Jafar. And then last but not least is the What's Next in OpenShift session on October 26th. So I don't know if they have staged that one yet or not, but I did just get the confirmation on it. So that is the roadmap session from the product management team. So we do 2 of those each year. So the What's New happens before every OpenShift release, which there are 3 of those a year, and then there are 2 roadmap sessions each year. So that is October 26th at 10 a.m. Eastern. For both of those What's New and What's Next sessions, I know I'll be here. I think Jonny will be here along with several of the other folks from across the Red Hat live streaming. Usually Mike Foster's on, et cetera. So be sure to join us. There are, of course, if you missed it, they're recorded. Great way to keep up with what's going on. We always publish all of the slides and everything over to Speaker Deck, and we'll update all of the video descriptions and everything as needed to keep up with that. Let's see some other things that are going on. Last week, just a reminder, or we talked about this last week, but just a reminder. So the Summit 2024 call for papers is open. So if you go to redhat.com/summit, you can get a link to that. Again, I always encourage, like, if there's something really cool, really interesting, whether or not you think it's really cool or really interesting, right? I think if you think other people might think it's really cool or really interesting, submit it, right? Let somebody tell you no instead of pre-selecting yourself or determining that nobody's going to care about it. So by all means, submit those things over if you would like suggestions or help or anything like that. Jonny has marketing in his title now. he doesn't. I'm just giving him a hard time because he's got a cold. But no, we're happy to provide feedback or anything like that if anybody wants to shoot us over a message about that. Let's see, what else have I got here? CSI migrations in vSphere 4.4 in vSphere with OpenShift 4.14. So we'll hear more about this tomorrow in the what's new, but the short version is that if you are using OpenShift or upgrading to OpenShift 4.14, there are some known bugs in the CSI migration that are going to require you to use vSphere version 7.0 U3L+, basically L or later, which is one heck of a version string, or 8.0 U2 or later. So just keep that in mind if you are preparing to begin your upgrade path. So remember, whenever we release a new OpenShift version, so in this case, OpenShift 4.14, it is available immediately to deploy fully supported GA, right, in new clusters on that day. You can also use the fast channel and upgrade fully supported on that same day. Stable typically takes somewhere between 60 and 90 days for the stable channel to open up for upgrades between previous versions. So 4.14 is an EUS release. So that means that you will be able to use the accelerated upgrade paths from 4.12 to 4.14 once that stable release channel opens up. But again, that won't be immediately. It takes some time for that to happen as they go through and collect information, right? Support cases, all that other stuff about it. What was the last one here? Opportunistically, since Chris is here and we just got, there's been a number of CVE notifications that have come out in the last few days. We were chatting about this before the stream started, and I think probably, and Chris pointed this out, probably the most public one, the one that's going to have the most widespread effects is CVE 2023-44487, which I will post a link to that here in the chat. And this is the HTTP2, is it, gosh, I just had this word. I just used this word. Why can I not remember this word? Is it
it's a request and cancel?
Yes.
Yeah.
Request and cancel. Reset. Thank you, Jonny.
Yeah.
In chat here. So the HTTP2 reset denial of service attack. So I think, if you click on that CVE link there, it'll take you to the landing page for all of Red Hat products. Let me share my screen here. Nope, not that button. This button. So this is the page that you'll land on if you click on that link. And if we look at this and scroll down, you'll see affected packages issued by, or affected packages and issued Red Hat security errata. Man, words are hard today. So if we go in and we just type OpenShift, spelled correctly, you'll note that there is a huge number of things that pop up here. So if we scroll down, there's 153 out of 461 entries have something OpenShift related. And you'll notice that there's a number of affected things. So, Chris, I want to pause here for a moment and give you the floor for a moment to talk a little bit about this one and kind of what it means. And also, I'm curious your perspective of, like, when we look at this, what does this mean, right? What does it look like, or what does it mean when I see this and it says affected versus under investigation and stuff like that?
Yeah, so this is some good questions here. This one is very, very bleeding edge, brand new, disclosed more or less yesterday in a couple of blog entries out there by some of the major cloud infrastructure companies and cloud providers out there. Kind of different than most of the other ones, where most vulnerabilities result from a bug in software implementation. And in fact, the two other prominent ones this week are exactly that. The way that memory is being allocated, the way strings are being written, the way input from the outside world is being trusted. But this one's different in that it appears to be a flaw in how the HTTP version 2 protocol is defined. It allows for the creation of multiple streams within a single HTTP connection. And what attackers are abusing here is the ability to cancel those streams. And so creating very, very high numbers of requests and then cancellations for those. and this is overwhelming the servers at the other end, creating a denial of service attack. What's notable about it is that I read in one case that they saw as few as, let's say, 20,000 machines in a botnet, overwhelming, creating hundreds of millions of requests per second. So it's lightweight for the client to execute, and it is a lot of work, on the server side. So that's as far as I think as it's gone. I haven't seen the latest on this, and we're going to leave it. Red Hat Product Security is doing the investigation currently. So I don't know what the solution is going to be, or or how deep this goes, but it looks like it's essentially just a denial of service. What's going to happen here is that there's going to be a couple different fixes, I think, that come out, but everything that uses HTTP2, right, from web server software, potentially clients, if there's a protocol change, we're all going to need to be updated. One of the workarounds suggested has been to disable HTTP version 2 and fall back to HTTP version 1.1, which would be effective and would be appropriate for traditional web applications. But there are a lot of things that have come to depend on HTTP version 2. So a little bit difficult. Every organization is going to need to make a decision about that. Stay tuned to that page, which, as you can see, says under investigation. This means that every product that Red Hat ships is being investigated for whether it's impacted by this vulnerability, and we'll come up with a product appropriate plan and impact assessment and resolution. So as the news continues, the product security teams are hard at work on this and the other ones. You'll see the updates there on that page.
Yeah, definitely keep an eye on the page, and they update this constantly. You can refresh and go look at the state, and once they have fixes in place for things, it'll show up under the errata.
Yep.
So one thing to note with the OpenShift process, basically everything gets updated at once, right? So when you go in and you trigger an OpenShift cluster update, from 4.13.x to 4.13.x plus 1 or whatever, it updates all of those things. So as you see things get fixed in the errata and all that, you don't have to go through and do them one by one. That's at the platform level. Keep in mind, if you're using, let's say there's something in UBI that's affected. If you're using, your application is built off of UBI packages, then you'll still need to rebuild your container images and stuff like that.
That's right. Yep. One of the other things that was noted was that since this is a denial of service, and many organizations are familiar with these types of attacks, many of them are using services that mitigate denial of service, either by relying on a cloud provider for hosting or front end, or specific services and security services out there. And they have found their controls to be pretty effective. It is a high volume denial of service attack, but it is something that can be handled right at the edge. So for organizations that may have some experience with distributed denial of service, this won't really be anything new, just the approach that's being taken. And so, it's a possibility. Also, of course, if you're unfortunately gather enough attention to gain the ire of some of these botnet controllers out there, you might see it. If you're not typically under those types of attacks, it's not any reason to believe that someone's going to come after you just because of this specific issue. So,
yeah, and I don't know if it's fortunate or unfortunate, but it is quote unquote only, right? A denial of service attack.
That's right.
So
that's right. Have you seen no evidence that there's any type of exploit here that would allow for remote access or unauthorized access in any way, or remote code exploit or anything else like that? It is really just abusing. It's like switching the light switch on and off and on and off and on and off until something breaks. It's really just going to aggravate people. I mean, it potentially leads to downtime. And we've seen where that kind of thing, a denial of service caused by a ransomware attack can have real world impacts, right? Think about hospitals where, IT systems that manage healthcare are impacted by this, right? That's a real possibility and kind of frightening. But, for most organizations, the risk of a denial of service is understood. If they've had some experience with it, they hopefully have some protections in place against that. And then these issues will get resolved as the software releases come out.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I always learn things every time we release one of these. I always learn more about the process and what happens kind of behind the scenes. And it's always fascinating to me to see how something like this, clearly broad reaching, how much of an immediate engagement and lift the engineering organizations across, all of Red Hat have, and going in and testing, validating, right? Figuring out what's going on and how to mitigate it. And it's always super impressive to me.
Yeah, I think it's really impressive. Yeah. Sorry, Jonny, go ahead.
No, that was my fault. Did you guys do the internal security training that just came out, like the product security put out? I was like, man, I had no idea that there was that much involvement. You know, like you see the CVEs, you hear about Red Hat's, you know, supporting them and stuff like that, but to see like the different stages that everything goes through, it's like, damn, that's pretty impressive. You know, it's pretty awesome actually.
Yeah, I think it's one of the most impressive parts about Red Hat since I've been here is that, you know, this is what customers trust about working with us, that the software we provide is, there's no guarantees that it's going to be secure forever. It's free of any issue, but when they are discovered, they're investigated thoroughly, they're open and honestly disclosed. We talked about this last week with vulnerability management, that, you know, Red Hat always has that open disclosure. And this page here that you can see is an open and honest disclosure about what is impacted. That investigation is going on. It'll be updated with either impacted or not impacted. And you know, will have the resources that you need to address it in your environment. So fantastic, reliable source. It makes the fire drill for our customers a little less, a little less raging fire and a little easier to put out, because we do all that work for them to make sure that they understand the risk and know the resolution.
Yeah, agreed. So I think that's all of the top of mind topics that I had in here. There's one or two other things we can cover that next week, just in the interest of time. So with that, I know there's a couple of questions that we were tracking, Jonny. Is there anything we want to ask now?
I think we can let Chris get started, and then we can circle back to Yasir's question, because I think Chris will most likely answer it, but if not, then I'll make sure that I ask it. You know,
Okay,
or I'll ask it anyways just to make sure.
There's also a question in there from Salman.
Yep.
Okay. All right. Yeah. R Hope 9, 8K of RAM. You know, what was the Bill Gates quote about? Was it 192 or something? You know, 64K. I don't remember what it was. You know, nobody will ever need more memory than that.
Oh yeah. And then Windows.
Yeah. So, Chris, configuration management. So one, I want to kind of put a precise definition on what that means to you, because, you know, in my mind, I think things like Ansible, I think things like GitOps, you know, all of these types of tools. So from your perspective, when we talk about configuration management for security, I'm assuming it's including tools like that, but also extending further upwards into the application stack and even what's happening inside of those applications.
That's right. Yeah. So we're talking about OpenShift, of course, which means we're talking about containers and Kubernetes. And so I think about it in that context. And then I think about it in terms of two areas, right? What I've been calling security of the cluster, right? Which is making sure that your OpenShift clusters are configured correctly, that you're using features like RBAC for user management correctly. And then we think about security in the cluster, which is the configuration that your developers are providing for their applications. It's all the stuff that goes into an application that's not part of the container image, right? So the container image contents we talked about last week, you should have, you know, as little stuff in there as possible, and then the stuff that you do have, you should maintain to stay up on vulnerability fixes. But the configuration is all the rest of it. It's possible to run, you know, vulnerability-free container image in an insecure way, right? By putting unlimited network exposure and unlimited levels of privilege on it. You know, this is also defense in depth, that you just have to assume there's a vulnerability in those images, even if it's not discovered yet, that there are 0 days that an attacker might know about. And we want to make sure that even if we see a breach, that we minimize what happens during that breach, right? This is a modern security philosophy of assume that there's a breach. We have to assume that our applications get compromised. What do we do then? And ideally, we make it impossible for any vulnerability to be exploited. A lot of them require certain levels of privilege and access, or a writable file system, or access to the network. And we can deny them that initial foothold. Or if they gain the foothold, let's contain them where they are, right? Compromising one pod is bad. Compromising the entire application suite on a cluster is terrible. So we keep them where they are by limiting their access to the rest of the environment. So
and
that to me is all that. Oh, sorry.
You're sort of defining the whole zero trust concept there, right?
That's right. Zero trust is a part of it. You know, one of the comments here was about, you know, developers don't understand what that means, and they're not used to developing that. And if I say, hey, developers, I want you to adopt zero trust, what does that mean, right? Like we have to break that down into individual concepts. I mean, literally down to YAML lines. This is what you should put in your YAML. This is what a network policy should be for your application, right? We want to make sure that it's not left to interpretation, and we want to make it less painful for these development teams who honestly have other responsibilities, right? They're responsible for the functionality of the application. We want to make it as easy as possible for them to build a more secure application out there.
I think part of that too is like mapping that. I love what you're saying with putting that. Here's the config you need, right? And then mapping that to like here's the layer in your defense in depth donut, right? Or here's the ring in your defense in depth donut that belongs to, and that's why you're doing it. So that way they get like the visual representation. So that way when they're going through their stack, they can kind of think of like, all right, from inside out, right? This is what it looks like.
That's right. And there's lots of good frameworks. So there are the NIST zero trust frameworks. There are, of course, compliance standards. So something like PCI DSS requires that you isolate cardholder data, which means that we're looking for controls. What we don't want to do is, again, tell the developer, hey, go implement PCI control 2.1. What we want to say is, these are the controls that you have to implement: a network policy for ingress, a network policy for egress, a non-privileged user account, and then those get linked in our reports to show that, hey, these implement PCI controls 2.1, 2. Whatever. I'm not counting. I don't remember the control numbers exactly, but those are the ideas that their policies are linked to that, and auditors see that evidence and they will accept that as a control for those things. What developers would get out of that bargain is, all right, I know what I have to do. I can box this in. It's all right. I could create 2 network policies. They have a specific format. I can use tools like ACS to kind of write them for me. So there's capabilities there that it's easy to hop from step to step and get to the goal. For some of the other things, one of the frameworks that people use is the MITRE ATT&CK framework. Right, this is an enumeration of the techniques, the tactics that attackers use. Right, so some of the stuff we talk about, a breach. A breach can involve several different techniques and tactics. Right, a remote code exploit leads to shell commands being run, which leads to someone running utilities to try to reconfigure, add backdoors, add user accounts, copy out data. Those are all mapped into these techniques. And, a lot of organizations are using that to inform their defenses. And so you can put these policies in place and map them to the techniques and tactics that attackers use, and understand that you're resilient to, sort of like administration overrides or, credential stealing and things like that. Always good to tie those up to those higher level goals. If nothing else, you can prove that you're doing your job. You can show to others in your organization that you have some awareness and effectiveness and effective controls in here. I think that making it as precise as possible for those developers whose primary job is not security, right? But now we're making it part of their job, giving them specific definitions rather than more nebulous things like we want zero trust. It makes it easier for them to implement that.
Yeah. So, from my days, and Johnny, you'll sympathize with this, right? When we used to do this sort of on a day-to-day basis, right? Day-to-day administration, balancing that with all of the other requirements, usually complexity through all of these different requirements, everything being layered on, often leads to brittleness and fragility.
Yeah. And
the more configuration we have to layer on top, the more things we need to check and validate and verify and ensure and all that, it leads to that fragility of one thing changed and suddenly it's a house of cards and my application is no longer running because I implemented this thing. And kind of where I'm going with all of that is, I feel like configuration management is one of those things that can significantly help to alleviate that, because then you authoritatively know what the configuration is supposed to be. And going back to, I don't remember which episode it was, Johnny. It was right after, what was the organization that had the issue where there was unknown, I think it was Reddit, when Reddit had their outage because there was unknown configuration that was running somewhere and they didn't know about it. So they went and they, refreshed the service or changed something, and it broke all kinds of things inside of there. So configuration management is important for a whole number of different reasons, not the least of which is just simply managing complexity.
Yep. It's a 12-factor application philosophy, right? The dependencies and configuration are explicitly in code and everybody's aware of them. There's no mystery about those things. It's part of the automation. Security configuration really just fits in with the rest of that. You declare your dependencies. Well, my dependency is on DNS services, so I have to have a network policy that allows me to talk to the DNS server. The important part about Kubernetes, what I like about it versus, there's other runtime environments, right? You could be running on a VM, you could be running in other services out there, but running a container on OpenShift means that these kinds of declarations are in my code. It's part of the application. It's not part of the cluster, and it's not part of my security tool. Like even if I am running something like ACS to do monitoring, ACS's job is not to change your configuration to something that's better, right? It's not there for security to say, okay, everybody has a read-only file system. Boom, change all the deployments. We don't want that. That leads to application outages. What we want to do is push back on the teams and say, this is a requirement from InfoSec. Here's how you implement it in YAML, so that when you're working on your laptop on a local, mini shift, right? You're using it in a context where it's going to be used in production, right? They say production is no different than anything else, right? Production is not unique. We want to run and test in those configurations there. The other thing I'll point out, there's a lot of configuration stuff that you can do, and you can lock down your containers in a way that makes it pretty inflexible, right? And developers naturally kind of grade against that. But security is one of those things that you don't have to be perfect all the time right away. It is a matter of risk. It's a matter of priorities. I'd love to see more organizations standardizing on the read-only file system wherever you can, but exceptions are going to be made. It's hard for developers to convert. Let's say you're modernizing an application from a virtual machine to a container. It's hard to restructure things to take that into account, and that's understandable. But every little bit that you can do helps. Last week we talked about obviously fixing vulnerabilities, but I like the approach better of reducing what's in your container image so that you're not managing the vulnerabilities of it. And if you can reduce your container footprint by a little bit, remove a few packages, those are things that that you can do really easily. That does help to improve the security of those applications. There's a whole host of these things, and we can talk about it. And a lot of times it's just a matter of picking and choosing which of them are easiest to implement. And there's no shame in that, right? Easy controls that are effective and lightweight are often better than more complex credit where credit is due to AI driven runtime security and all that. But if we can honestly just latch the gate on our way out, right?
Yeah.
That's the simplest thing here. That'll keep people out.
Yeah.
So
Little
that's the
things,
philosophy.
little things that add up, right? And it's just
Yeah.
don't be lazy, right? As I tell my kids all of the time. And as I learned back when I was a junior admin doing physical installs in a data center, right? Don't be lazy and create a big tangled mess out of all the cables in the back of the rack, right? Take the extra 30 seconds, put them in there, and make it look at least halfway nice, and you're going to avoid a lot of problems in the future.
Yeah. And Chris, a lot of stuff that you're talking about, right? Like, the easy things, the low hanging fruit, those are relatively, let's just call them like, those are the literal easy things to implement, right? But some of the harder things like network policies and stuff like that, those are cry once configurations. And what I mean by cry once is like, you go through the pain one time to figure out how to do it, and then you can apply it and you can rinse and repeat, right? So it's a cry once thing. Whereas like if you're doing something kind of ad hoc, you're not using some configuration management tool, you're doing the same thing over and over again, and you're relearning every time. So you're just implementing all these different pain points all the time, and instead of taking what do what you got to do, make it work the way that you need to, scrub it, renew and reuse. So it's not a difficult concept, but it's a difficult culture to implement, right? Like, I think that like people are like, yeah, we can do that, but then the actual do it in practice is completely different.
That's right, and it is putting responsibility on folks who build and operate applications where it wasn't before, right? Something like network policies is it's like firewall rules, and these are typically the domain of the InfoSec department, especially around network security, network engineering folks. Here, we're not removing any of that responsibility because enterprises still have networks and clouds still have networks, and you have perimeters. But within the OpenShift cluster, you can reduce risk on that per application basis by using that. Now, I feel like network policies in Kubernetes, I think the time has come, right? I think that it has been very difficult. I think it has been uneven implementations of this, right? It hasn't always been supported in every Kubernetes, but OpenShift adopted this with OpenShift 4. A lot of the other platforms have now settled on this. We're seeing the last few major platforms out there adopt these as the standard. It's been in Kubernetes since like 1.13 or something. So it's broadly implemented, and there is good tooling, right? There are tooling like ACS has for not just runtime analysis, right? And many people have seen ACS, have seen that you can look at, the history of pod activity. This made container, connections to these other containers. You can now do that statically. So this is a work that ACS team has been doing with IBM in an open source project to statically analyze Kubernetes YAML files in an application. So you take a whole bunch of your deployment YAML for a given application, all of its services and config maps, all the deployment YAML. You put it through this parser that effectively builds that virtual connectivity map. Like, hey, we see that this is going to talk to a database because we see a database host name and port in an environment variable. So it looks for these connection hints to build this for you. And so you can come up with this map of what the communication paths are, and from that generate the network policies without having a single container up and running. And you can do this in a CI/CD pipeline. You can get those network policies into source code. They go through the normal revision process. And now changing a firewall rule is a pull request, right? We're making the change control process for networking here as part of the very familiar, code change process. So I think like this area has been, I think, unaddressed, right? I think a lot of folks leave their Kubernetes clusters kind of hard shell on the outside with the perimeter well defined and enforced, but inside is this, kind of open, all fair, everything's fair. So we're going to try to see that, right? We're going to try to see. We're hopefully going to see more customers adopting this idea that zero trust within the clusters themselves, just for the purpose of containing an attacker when they land in there, for meeting regulatory requirements or just good sane security configuration. But the technology's been there. The limit has been how difficult is this for teams to adopt, and I think that's something that ACS has really been trying to pioneer. Is this? Let's make this as simple as possible for folks to implement.
Well, I think there's something to be said for application security and compromise versus platform security and compromise. So sure, you're running in Kubernetes, you're running in OpenShift. So there's no root containers, there's SCCs that prevent these things, there's network policies that limit communication, right? There's all of these things at the platform level that prevent or hopefully, ideally at least mitigate a escalation or something like that. But that doesn't mean that the application itself can't be compromised. And the data that's going through there, the application, whatever's happening itself, can't be exploited and taken advantage of, and without ever affecting the underlying platform, the core OS or anything like that.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, application logic abounds, and so there's plenty of places where teams mistakenly trust user input, right? The old classic SQL injection. Well, there's lots of other types of things like
little
that.
Bobby tables.
That's right. You take raw input and you process it directly, and then suddenly you find your application is running, strange commands. And even if it is unprivileged, and even if it is, not able to compromise other pods or containers, that landing spot is still valuable. It may not be visible to most organizations, but you certainly don't want your containerized application to become one of the bots in those botnets, right? That we see. That remote command and control that is a common goal of these attackers. So this is a lot to take in sometimes, but as I said, getting better with security, progressing, right, taking little steps. They can have dividends now and in the future. It could make the vulnerabilities that were announced this week a little less worrisome, right? Knowing that you can't, nobody's going to be able to privilege escalate. Nobody's going to be able to write to the file system. Nobody's going to be able to use curl to, download something from the internet. These are things that, that help at least the teams to feel a little bit better, sleep better at night about their application security.
Yeah. So Jonny, questions. Let's circle back to some questions here.
Yep. So we had Yasir, and I apologize if I messed your name up. Will future security/vulnerability management methods reduce system downtime and disruptions?
Well, it depends on what I mean by future here. I think the future is here already. If you have built a really true DevOps process and you've got automation and pipelines where you can rebuild software and you're doing that on the regular every day, every week at a minimum, you've got often rebuilding and re-importing those dependencies. I think that vulnerability management becomes easier, becomes less downtime, right? The process of vulnerability management for an application running in OpenShift is I rebuild, I retest, I redeploy, I replace what's there, right? I roll out my services in a rolling, fashion. I replace one container image with another, and the vulnerability management just becomes part of that automated process, right? Then I'm spending less time taking down applications, of course, for an emergency. I'm spending less time, contacting people in a manual method and saying, "Hey, what about this vulnerability or that one?" Everything just kind of follows the process. Most of these are, you know, these vulnerabilities are fixed quickly by the upstream projects, distributed quickly by folks like Red Hat, and are available to you right away. And so, taking advantage of that, like all the work that Red Hat does, is key to this. In the future, I think what we're going to get is better risk assessment about vulnerabilities. This might lead to, fewer of these things that are treated as really critical, right? Because you're going to see more data about it. Like, are these being actively exploited? Are there things in the wild? Again, today, our example today of this denial of service, this is actually being exploited in the wild, and we're seeing it for real. So, but there'll be a more, I guess, more accurate assessment of the true risk of some of these things. Now, it's a little tough. You don't ever really want to leave a vulnerability left. If there's a fix available, you really should fix it. But in terms of the disruption that it creates, the cooler heads can prevail when these attacks aren't imminent. The challenge is going to be, of course, that with more software, there's more vulnerabilities, right? It's a pretty good gig these days if you're a computer science student to write your master's thesis on finding a vulnerability in software. There's incentives for organizations out there to find these things. There's incentive for attackers. So we're seeing the number of vulnerabilities that get disclosed to just exploding, right? Just huge amounts of these. Luckily, most of them are very low importance. They have very little risk of being exploited. They don't have demonstrated attacks. So higher volume, more noise, but I think better data to be able to sort through that noise is the future of things.
Your statement earlier made me think of a quote. The future is here; it's just not evenly distributed.
That's right.
Which is I looked it up. It's from December 4th, 2003, so almost exactly 20 years old, which is pretty impressive.
Oh,
Excuse me, but I think to your point, there is a lot of tools, there is a lot of things out there, and when we say reduce system downtime and disruptions, what does that actually mean? Is it, oh, I won't have to reboot a node anymore? Well, why is that disruptive, right? Rebooting an underlying node might be disruptive because I'm having to terminate pods and reschedule them elsewhere. If my application is architected in such a way that it tolerates that, is that really disruptive? So it's an interesting way to look at the world of, in a lot of cases, those things are already there to help mitigate those or, resolve those as the case may be, and applying those mitigations. But interesting perspective, I think.
Yeah, as Johnny said, it's cry now, right? But like if you build the system properly here, you'll be reaping the benefits of that. That's why I like to focus. When I talk to my customers, it's not about fixing a vulnerability. It's about establishing a process by which those fixes
100%.
get imported and done as automatically as possible, so that whether it's a critical new vulnerability that's very broadly impacted or a tiny little niche vulnerability that probably no risk at all, either way, they all get fixed. They all get addressed, and you never sit there and think about the impact of any individual one. So
All right, so we had another question from Salman, and it was, do we have any standard operator available to ensure the PCI DSS compliance for the Red Hat OpenShift pod? So I'm assuming, they're talking about from the OpenShift namespaces.
Yeah. So for sure, for PCI compliance, there are profiles, first of all, for the OpenShift compliance operator, right? This is the OpenSCAP engine that processes rules and provides reports. So that's been something that's been part of OpenShift for quite a while. And there is a PCI DSS compliance standard for that. It's currently for PCI 3.2. PCI 4.0 is in the works. So for those asking that natural follow-on question, that is in the works. So the compliance operator is one place for that. The advanced cluster security product that I keep referring to, ACS, also has its own PCI compliance tests that complement that. And these PCI checks are more at the pod level, at the deployment level. So where PCI requires configuration of the platform and OpenShift can implement that, that's going to be in the compliance operator report. Where PCI requirements like isolation of cardholder data really apply at the individual software component level, that's where ACS can assess and provide guidance for that. Recently, the ACS product was a new feature was created here to allow us to import those PCI profiles. So the results from the compliance operator can be shown in the ACS dashboard. You can get that kind of consolidated view of both the infrastructure configuration as well as the application configuration. So it's worth checking out. There's a lot of work going on in this space. There are new profiles for compliance operator for things like the DISA STIG for OpenShift. There's lots of stuff happening around this because compliance is a big driver of technology investment and changes. And so it's something that our customers are having to deal with, and it's something that Red Hat has responded to.
And you can't shush it away anymore, right? It's
right.
not something that you can think about later. It's something that you literally have to like put at the forefront now. And it's pretty awesome to see the pendulum kind of swing back this way, you know, like, because for so long it was always security and compliance and stuff like that was like, okay, I see that you're there, but what are you really going to do? But then now it's like, I'm legitimately going to shut you down if you don't get this fixed.
That's right. And yeah, we're going to see more teeth, I think, in regulations, right? Penalties associated with that. PCI is, you know, pretty strong. Like anybody who's subject to these rules can actually have their ability to take credit cards revoked. It's a pretty serious thing. It takes a few steps to get there, but that's a business existential risk, right? That risks the existence of your business here. And so there's definitely a lot of focus on it. The auditors in this space have, you know, seen what's capable, you know, what the capabilities are here. A lot of auditors that are becoming familiar with platforms like OpenShift. And I think that the controls, like I said, it's in many cases better than what you could get on a virtual machine out there because you have this software driven control.
So I think
we have.
Go ahead, Jonny.
I was going to say we have another question from Hasif, and it is there are so many ACS policies that are violated on OpenShift star namespaces. Are those safely ignorable or any mitigation required?
This is a good question. So the first question I would have in response is what version of ACS are you using? So like any security tool, we examine everything in an OpenShift cluster. And we look at all of the components that are running in OpenShift. And we did have a period of time where we were tracking violations of things like, hey, this is running with a privilege level that we don't like. It has a, you know, software components that we don't like. It had some matching criteria. And a lot of those were understandable. You know, we expect like OpenShift networking components to run with access to the network and at high levels of privilege. So those policies have been, I think, correctly scoped in ACS. So the ACS configuration is changed in the 4.x release timeframe to make those much less often, much less often, so that you know, that we're still monitoring for things, right? If an OpenShift component got compromised, right, we want to be able to identify, let's say, the runtime activity that resulted from that. If someone is using the API server to remotely exec commands into an OpenShift pod, right? We want to be aware of that. So ACS still monitor those components, but for the known configuration, right, that the acceptable risk parts of it, those policies have all been amended. And we continue to do that, right? As new components are issued, as new versions of OpenShift comes out, the ACS and OpenShift teams are collaborating on what the appropriate policies are for the built-in infrastructure. But as I like to point out, we're not going to drop our visibility here. We still do vulnerability scans, right? This is about that open and honest disclosure. ACS provides you with absolute transparency about what's running in your cluster, and that includes the OpenShift components. So if there's a vulnerability, if there's potentially threat activity in those pods, you are going to see that. It's just part of the duty that the product has to deliver to our customers, that transparent view of things.
I mean, you'd be leaving a pretty substantial gap if we didn't report on those things. You know,
That's right.
Easy place to hide.
Yep, and other products, of course, you know, do the same. What we have here is the benefit of good knowledge about OpenShift and its operators, and an understanding of you know, of whether they're appropriate or not for those applications. It takes a lot of time. I mean, this is what ProdSec does. This is what the OpenShift engineering teams do to assess that. Like, is this a valid thing, or is it an understood configuration that that we use. This, by the way, is capability in ACS that's available to our customers, right? Sometimes you need to make exceptions to policy, right? There are certain things that are going to run as root. There are certain things that are going to run with high levels of service account privileges, right? And so the ACS policy can easily make an exception for that, so that you know that, hey, we have risk here, but it's acceptable because we have to run this application. It requires this level of authentication or level of service account access.
So I think, and if anybody has any questions, please go ahead and feel free to post those into the chat. We'll address those as they come up and as we can. And if you're not listening to us live, feel free to reach out. You can reach out to myself at andrew.sullivan@redhat.com or Jonny at JONNY, Jonny@redhat.com. We're happy to take those questions, and we'll coordinate with Chris and get answers and all that stuff. So don't hesitate, whether you're watching us now or watching us later. But I want to circle back around to the configuration management aspect. So Chris, do you have any thoughts, recommendations, suggestions on sort of that baseline of things or baseline of processes, tools that folks should use when they're adopting configuration management for security-centric purposes?
So as far as tools, I mentioned ACS a couple times. There's another open source project that came from StackRox called Kubelinter, which is another good one. If development teams are familiar with linters that provide guidance towards good coding practices and formatting and other things, they can be configured in a way to test for specific conditions. And we created Kubelinter to do that for your Kubernetes YAML, right? To point out opportunities where you could be doing better. ACS has a sort of an equivalent, although it's got a little bit more teeth because the enforcement capabilities are there. What I would look at is going all the way back to KubeCon papers on security, right? Going back to the KubeCon disclosure about the assessment of the Kubernetes code base, right, by Trail of Bits and others, right? The presentations that they gave were really eye-opening about all the different configurations that impact the security of an application, right? And why they're confusing, sometimes conflicting. It wasn't just about issues in the Kubernetes source code, of which there were a few and they were corrected, but more about the kind of towering problem of developers understanding the complex interaction between all these different things, between RBAC and service accounts and privilege levels and capabilities and all these things. So the sort of the wisdom that came out of that about guiding people towards better configuration there, and some of the gotchas to look out for is pretty eye-opening. Even again 4 years later after that assessment was done. There's a bunch of other things, of course, like that. We've given presentations on this topic before. My big three are that think about things like read-only file systems and egress network policies. Think about dropping capabilities. Like, these are all things that you cannot practically do in a VM that you can easily do in a container. And that's what makes containers such an exciting thing for me here, is that you can constrain your applications in a way that's just not practical in other formats and deliver security that's better than you could get in other traditional ways of application hosting.
So I'm going to throw a curveball at you, Chris. Let's think about OpenShift virtualization for a moment. Are there differences, improvements, maybe detriments, bad, worse things with VMs that are running inside of OpenShift and sort of the set of tools in OpenShift in Kubernetes that surround those VMs? So I'm thinking like network policy. You can use a network policy to control interaction with that virtual machine in the same way that you can with any other pod. Service mesh and MTLS between those endpoints, all of that type of stuff. Does that apply? Is that something that is good, bad?
It does. I mean, certainly. So you pointed out some of the advantages, right? That you can take advantage of some of these capabilities that are part of OpenShift, part of Kubernetes, just by moving that virtual machine over there, right? At the same time, it's still difficult to constrain a virtual machine, right? Those pods have to run with a specific set of privileges because they have their own kernel in them. The virtual machines themselves are going to have traditional virtual machine challenges. So you are bringing in some opportunity to manage that configuration and limit things, but you still have the virtual machine there. I think of OpenShift virtualization as a great place to modernize applications where you are moving to a containerized format where you can, and you're using OpenShift virtualization where you can't, or it's not practical today. Again, little steps in security, right? It's all an improvement. So I think that improving in whatever way you can. Now the motivation to move to OpenShift virtualization is driven by a lot more than just security, and there's other overwhelming business requirements that might dictate whether you do or don't. But I'm always going to be that little birdie, talking like, hey, there's a security advantage here. There's something you can do, and then satisfy auditors and meet your company's requirements. Show your PCI auditors that you're meeting the standards today and in the future. So
Yeah. I've always tried to take the approach of, even if you have no intention of modernizing those applications, particularly when it spans containers and virtual machines, you can at least standardize the set of tools and the way that you interact with it. And so that,
Mhm.
you have, going back to configuration management tools, let's say I'm using GitOps, right? I can deploy, I can manage, and I can configure those things using the same methodology. And, it just makes life easier in that respect.
yep. And I think
With
there's a
good
lot
build
of
hygiene,
promise here. Go ahead.
sorry, Chris.
Sorry.
I was gonna say, like when you, it's just like when you're building container images, right? Like you were saying earlier, don't build a single image with all the stuff in it, right? Make purpose-built images. It's the same thing with your VMs, right? If you have your templates that are super skinny and they have exactly what they need just to get started, and then you add on for what that machine needs, right? That also helps reduce your footprint and attack surface.
That's right. Yeah, and you don't have to be perfect right off the bat, right? Because nobody's going to stand for a 6-month outage while you modernize applications by taking everything into account. But you can bring in improvements bit by bit, right? And those are valuable. There's always going to be risk. I mean, you're running an application on the internet. There's always going to be risk, and so you just have to decide what's acceptable. Changing conditions can dictate that. Your own policies changing can dictate what that risk is, acceptable. For most organizations, getting some of the basic stuff done is a dramatic improvement over what was happening before with on-premise virtual machines. Once you stop assuming the infrastructure and you stop assuming the isolation of things like data centers, then you see all these opportunities. You take advantage of some of them there, and you're getting to better security, right? So.
Yeah, our Hope 9 asked a question here about future versions of ACS that would be able to make reports which include recommendations on how to reduce slack rather than actual vulnerabilities. Or is there another better suited tool for that?
That's a good question. I assume that by Slack, things that the extra stuff that comes with your container image that doesn't isn't necessary. There are a few policies in ACS that do this already. So things that have no business being in a container image, right? Utilities like package managers, container user management, even things like curl in image, right? Which everybody loves, but do you really need that in production? Unless you're linking to libcurl, having the curl binary in your image is always a problem, right? Because attackers love to use it, and it's got a new vulnerability this week. So there are some policies that would help you remove some of those contents. And then of course there's a bunch of things that tell you you have privilege levels that you don't need or likely don't need, right? That there's configuration that you could change to reduce the privilege levels of it. If I'm understanding the question correctly there. In the future, I mean, there's always possibility. One of the things that we've been thinking about is helping customers understand which components in their containers are actually in use versus not. You use a container image like Red Hat UBI, comes with a lot of stuff. If you're not using, I don't know, like an LDAP client, like that component can maybe be removed if we don't ever see it operating in the container environment there. So there's definitely some interesting techniques like that of helping you understand actual usage patterns, and again, constraining your container behavior towards those usage patterns. So.
So I think we're coming up towards the end of our time. I think we got about 10 minutes or so left. So for anybody who's watching us, please go ahead and send us any of your questions that you happen to have.
Steve just sent a question.
Okay.
He says, they said, I know the egress network policy is supported in this use case, but this will not restrict communications within the cluster.
Right. So egress network policy is the terminology here is kind of difficult to parse, right? The egress network policy is an object that allows for the whole cluster effectively to restrict the outgoing network communications. What I've been talking about is mostly a network policy object that has a type of egress in it. And actually, network policies can have both ingress and egress, selectors. The syntax is a lot painful, but you can make rules about where connections are allowed to come from using namespace and label selectors, and where your egress is allowed to go to, again by selectors like that, or even by CIDR ranges. So that I'm talking about the just plain old network policy object, and not the things that are specific to the egress network policy object. And the network policy of type egress definitely does allow you to stop communication within the cluster at the pod level. Each individual deployment will not be able to communicate it unless it has a matching egress rule. That's one of the things that makes dealing with network policies difficult, is that in order for communication to work, because network policies are denied by default, you have to have matching ingress and egress rules on both sides. And again, it's something like the tooling that ACS has created, this new capability that allows you to do that automatically, because what a pain it is to sort that out, automatically. The other thing that we often hear about is that many of the container networking platforms out there have their own policies. So if you're using something like Calico or Cilium, and they have, again, they're not network policy, they're not that object, they have other names, and they do things like global egress or other types of rules. And that's something else that ACS doesn't really address today. They have their own tooling. Those products are good in providing same effective capabilities here, but they do it through their own method. I'm not going to judge one way or the other. I'm most familiar with what ACS and OpenShift does, but a lot of customers are running happily with those products to restrict network. The important point here is that it's really practical to enumerate what a pod is going to communicate on the network and limit it to that. It's not practical to do that in a virtual machine, but it is more practical to do that here in a container and approach that deny by default kind of policy. And I think it's really coming around. The tooling is getting there to the point where it is more practical to do this.
Yeah, so Omar, I see here, is asking a question about documented methodologies or guidelines to use for security tools in OpenShift so that we can reduce risk in a structured manner. So my sort of default reaction or response to anytime people ask for documentation is to point them to the OpenShift security guide and the layered approach to security white paper. So I'll post both of those links. I don't know if you have any other suggestions, Chris.
So there is a Kubernetes native security white paper as part of the ACS materials that I think that I like as well, and just what it is and why it matters, and it applies to OpenShift as well as other Kubernetes platforms as well. But yeah, there's I don't know if there's any specific like one Uber guide like that.
Yeah.
There are of course the more technical, prescribed things like the CIS benchmarks for OpenShift, right? The hard-hitting guides for that. So if you want the technical details of that, those documents, those rules are available as well.
Let's see, and Indian technology guy also asked a question. It's okay if we're to ask questions not related to today's topic. We don't mind at all. So best way to install OpenShift on a machine to give it a try. Preferably in a false way. So all of OpenShift is open source. However, if you are using OpenShift proper, you do need some sort of entitlement beyond the trial period. So for single user non-production use cases, you can use developer entitlement. Just go to developer.redhat.com, register for an account, and you have access to up to 16 nodes worth of entitlements there. Or you can use the upstream OKE, which is at OKD. I don't know why I can never keep those things straight. I'd really gotta. You'd think 5 years in I'd be able to get those straight. OKD. So if you go to okd.io, it'll have links. It'll have documentation on how to do all that other stuff. So that being said, if you just want to get hands-on, like see what an OpenShift cluster looks like, probably the fastest way on your own infrastructure, your own resources, is to use OpenShift local. So you can go to quite simply try.openshift.com. It'll have links to OpenShift local, OpenShift sandbox. It'll take you to console.redhat.com, right? It'll take you all the different places where you can get hands-on with it. And I'll put that link into here. which is just https://try.openshift.com. I just got to type it in to copy and paste. Oops.
While talking.
Well, so yeah, and my brain and my brain, my mouth, and my fingers all have to align, or it all goes sharply downhill. Like this is well known. So just a couple of minutes left. So first, thank you very much to our audience. We really appreciate the questions, the interactivity. There's a reason why we wanted to devote an entire month's worth of topics to security, because it's a super important topic. And it's not always, the most exciting or, the most, not everybody is like Chris and gets out of bed in the morning and is like, security is my thing, security is my jam, right? Type of thing. But it's reality, and it's a thing that all of us have to be responsible for. And so leading into KubeCon, we wanted to take time. We wanted to devote, because it's been a while since we really talked in depth about security. We wanted to devote some of our resources into that and really just let's look at it. So leading into the next couple of weeks, if anybody has any questions, if there's anything that you're curious about, please feel free to shoot us over those questions, whether we're live or whether we're not. Again, you can reach me at andrew.sullivan@redhat.com as soon as I find my little link here. Or you can reach out to me on the various social media platforms at Practical Andrew. You can also reach out to Jonny at Jonny, JONNY at redhat.com, or JRockTX1 across all of the various social media platforms. I typically encourage folks, if you don't want to reach out via social media, the typical X / Twitter or Reddit or any of those, or even email, you can also reach out to us on the Kubernetes Slack. So if you go to kubernetes.slack.com, if you don't have an account there, register for one. And then there is an OpenShift users channel that is Jonny and I and 4,500 of our closest friends, and we're always happy to have conversations, answer questions. I say that the community there is fantastic. Jonny and I very rarely get involved. There's a bunch of folks who just do an amazing job of answering questions, helping people, right? Lots and lots of stuff. So I always encourage folks to go there. It's a great community. And then, of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't also talk about the official OpenShift community, which is Commons. So you can just go to, is it commons.openshift.org, I think, Jonny?
I believe so.
Yeah, or maybe just openshift.org.
OpenShift Commons.
Yeah, thank you. And they also have a Slack channel there for OpenShift Commons, as you just posted up there. So with that, Chris, I don't know if you have any closing thoughts, closing words that you want to put out there.
Keep an eye on your access.redhat.com CVE reports today. There's going to be some changes. It's been a pretty exciting week, so stay tuned there. And look forward to seeing everybody on another OpenShift Ask an OpenShift Admin session.
Yeah. Oh, I see Omar posted a question here. What is the most difficult security control to implement, and why?
Well, that's a really good question. What's the difficult? I mean, so in working with customers that are adopting ACS, at least, the network policy limitations have been the hardest to implement, right? They're hard to write. Network policy objects are the syntax is a little, obtuse. It requires some knowledge about how they work and how they're implemented. And they're not as obvious, so I think that folks kind of ignore them. You don't need them in order to function. So, we've been working a long time with StackRox and now with ACS to try to make that a little bit simpler, provide some of that tooling. I really do think that recent developments here have made this a much, much easier control to implement. No doubt that it is more work for the teams that are building and managing these apps, but I think the payoff is pretty significant. So it's a control that I encourage everybody to look at. I think it's going to be really important for compliance standards. And I think that, again, it's one of those things that you get that makes container security potentially better than your virtual machine security. So.
Yeah, and there's Alan asked two questions here. So one, plan for Terraform in the installer. So for anyone who isn't aware, Terraform changed their open source license after a certain version that I'm not remembering off the top of my head. So the OpenShift installer utilizes Terraform internally. So I don't have any additional information. I don't know what the precise plan is there, other than the engineering teams are looking into that, right? It is something that they're, of course, keenly aware of and working very diligently to figure out what might happen. So once we know more information about that, once we have a plan going forward, I'm sure that it'll be something that Jonny and I, and maybe we can rope in some of the engineering folks to come on and talk about it and what it means. Let's see, is ACS, also from Alan, is ACS going to steer away from policies? My organization is afraid that it's a bit too Red Hat centric or Red Hatty.
Red Hatty. Mm-hmm. So I don't think ACS is going to steer away from policies. I mean, the policy engine is there to ultimately to implement the business security requirements that you have and put restrictions on what teams can do. It sets the guardrails. Now, these policies, most of them did not come from Red Hat. They came from us at StackRox prior to Red Hat acquiring it. But a lot of them you'll see are driven by things like Docker's CIS benchmark around these, or just good industry standards like NIST. They're not very Red Hatty at all, in fact. So I'm a little bit confused by the question. But the idea here is that we implement policies, and we bring new default policies in when there's new capabilities in Red Hat, or if there is a need, right? Something happens in the industry or in the standards out there. So you'll see the policy engine and the policies that are available in there getting updated for that. In fact, there's some new stuff in the latest release. And of course, you're always welcome to disable, remove the default policies and use your own. So that's always a possibility there.
Yeah, Alan, continuing on there, better question is, how can we calm the nerves of an organization that they think it's too Red Hat centric?
Well, I mean, I'm not sure how to prove otherwise. The ACS product was designed around the Kubernetes API, and so it is, of course, OpenShift as part of its app platform has a Kubernetes API, and so it works equally well on other platforms, and the policies that we have are equally valid. The big difference that you'll see is some of our policies in ACS seem a bit redundant on OpenShift, like don't run as root user, right? And that's prevented for you, right? But in other platforms, it is possible to run as the root user. And so the policy makes more sense there. There's very little in ACS that, requires OpenShift or is specific to that, where the solution, there are some things like we have a policy to identify who's been using the kube admin secret. Some of those things are set that way by default in OpenShift. So there are some things there. The other thing about it, of course, if you have an app platform and you have software coming from Red Hat and you have a security tool from Red Hat, the concern could be that maybe we're hiding something, maybe that we're treating, Red Hat software a little better than we should be, that we're not providing that transparency. And, the earlier question proves that we're definitely not doing that, right? That ACS is a security tool. It provides that open and honest transparency, even when the news isn't good. So the product is not, impacted by that issue here, where we would attempt to hide anything or minimize the risk of something that just because it came from Red Hat. For I guess one other aspect of this is that Red Hat does provide for vulnerability assessment. We talked about this last week. A vulnerability assessment for Red Hat software. I mean, our teams are the authority on Red Hat software. And so whatever vulnerability scanning you're using should be respectful of Red Hat's security assessments. ACS is, of course, but there are a number of other third-party vulnerability tools that are as well. And this is because Red Hat does a specific assessment about a vulnerability in the distribution of packages that we have. And the risk of not using that Red Hat assessment is that you're going to end up with false positives. You're going to end up with things that look like an important, higher scoring thing, but on Red Hat, they're actually non-impactful or lower impactful. And you'll be chasing things that are, not worth your time chasing. Yeah. So that's the recommendation there.
We talked about that a little bit last week of how, sometimes Red Hat just builds the packages differently, and it mitigates those things just out of the box, even though the version is exactly the same because it was built by Red Hat and we used different compiler flags and stuff. It's,
Yep.
And I know the RHEL folks can give they have an excellent presentation and breakdown of like why it's different, right? Why, Red Hat Enterprise Linux is different than, the equivalent upstream. There was another one in here. Omar, is there security considerations for Terraform? I I don't know the answer to that. I mean, I'm sure there is, but if it's a part of the OpenShift installer, it gets, lumped in and brought in with all of our other stuff. So, if you're speaking of within OpenShift, it would be encompassed in our security, risk assessments. If you're using it independently or separately, that would be different. Jonny, you might know this one. I don't know off the top of my head. From Hakan, what is the control plane certificate lifetime?
I was just looking this up.
I want to say it's 1 year, and they get cycled halfway through, but I might be wrong.
The CAs are 10 years, and then they cycle automatically. But it's like I think you're right about the internal certificates themselves are 1 year. It really depends on which part of the control plane he's talking about. Like the API certificates, they rotate. I think it's like every year or something like that.
Yeah.
But yeah, the certificate authorities are good for 10. But the individual certificates, it varies on the level of service. So if it's an ingress or if it's a like a service certificate or something like that.
Yeah. Alan is asking, is there an upstream project for ACS?
Yeah, in fact, it carries the name StackRox. So the original company name and brand is being used for the upstream project there. You can find it on GitHub. You can get started at stackrocks.io, and you'll find the GitHub releases out there on the organization called StackRox. Along with Kubernetes, the StackRox project in there is the main upstream source of that we build ACS from, which it's available like anything else in Red Hat upstream open source.
And shameless plug, if you want to try the cloud version of StackRox, don't click that link because that link is crazy long. Holy crap. I got that out of the video description, so I'm like, holy hell, how is it that? That's crazy. I'll find a better link.
Yes, there is a cloud service version of ACS, and if you're a Red Hat customer and you're using Red Hat Console, there is a free trial available, and I think that's just redhat.com/ACS trial. It's a 60-day trial for the service version of ACS, but the software, the self-managed version, remains open source and remains available at stackrocks.io. StackRox, and what else? So the question is, so the StackRox organization in GitHub has two major projects up there. One is the StackRox product itself. You'll find the repository for that. The other one is called Kubernetes. This is an open source project that examines Kubernetes YAML files for typical misconfiguration issues, as well as security hints and things. It's somewhat in the philosophy of ACS, but it's a distinct project. So Kubernetes is one of those.
Yeah, so I think that answered your question there, Alan, of StackRox and what else. Kubernetes was the other one. And then I just posted in. So the second link there, which is the redhat.com link, is the one that that link that Jonny posted leads to, just with the without the YouTube redirect in there. Yep. All right. So I think that's all the questions. So Chris, thank you so much again for coming on. I love these conversations. I always have so much fun, and I enjoy learning so much from you. I said last week that security itself is just a huge, massive world, and you live in there every day, and I just tangentially bump up against it every once in a while. So it's always fascinating to learn more from you. So thank you very much for coming on, both today as well as last week.
You're welcome. Look forward to finding another spot where I can come in and have a conversation. It's been loads of fun.
Yeah, you are welcome anytime, and maybe next time we can dig in and look at some of the ACS things. Like maybe get a demo and look at how it helps to address or make the lives of our administrators easier, right?
Absolutely.
And with that, so for everyone who is watching us live, please don't forget about the what's new in OpenShift 4.14 that is happening tomorrow, and then we will see you back next week. Jonny, I will leave you with last words, sir.
Good seeing you again, Chris. You're awesome. Really appreciate your time. Lots of knowledge that you dumped on us, and yeah, it's I think it's really great. And to the audience, thank you for all the interaction. Like, this is really, it's what makes it exciting. So thank you very much for all this.
Thanks, everyone.